Welcome to episode 37 of Posture Labs and Alignment Fundamentals. My name is Emma and I'm your guide. This is going to be a super fun one. In this week's episode, we are talking about upward facing bow or Urdhva Dhanurasana. In some lineages of yoga, people call this full wheel or wheel pose as well, but I always refer to it as upward facing bow. The shape is the same, so it doesn't matter so much what you call it, but we're gonna go ahead and get started. This is a pretty deep back bend. I'll give you one modification with blocks, but you'll need a wall as well. If you're gonna do that modification, just make sure you watch the tutorial first before you go ahead and give it a shot. This one, you don't really wanna be turning your head side to side as you're doing this pose. So for upward facing bow, this is a pretty deep back bend. If you're newer to yoga, I would recommend starting with bridge pose, which we did last week, and then gradually working your way up to this. When I teach classes on YouTube, I always recommend that if you've never done this pose, you try to do it with a teacher in person first, just because it can be a lot on your neck, it can be a lot on your upper back and your shoulders. So it would be better to have a teacher there who can help you and see how it's working in your body. However, if you want to give it a shot on your own, I'm going to do my best to explain all of the different components of the pose right now. So for the unmodified version, you'll be starting on your back similar to like what we would do in bridge pose, which was last week's tutorial. So if you haven't watched that, I'd recommend checking that one out. So your feet are flat, your arms are by your side. Now I actually want you to lift your hips up the same way you would into bridge pose. So you basically start in a bridge pose. If this feels comfortable, then and only then I would have you move on and place your hands beside your ears. You want to point your fingers towards your shoulders. So the thumbs are in towards the ears, and try not to let your elbows flop out. You want to think about hugging the elbows in towards your ears or towards your temples almost. Now from here, I'm going to drive down into my heels. I'm going to push into my hands. I'm going to start by coming onto the top of my head. At this point, if I need to readjust my hands, I can. Now I don't want to just rest on my head, and my hands are actively working. At this point, I'll probably know if this is too much flexion on my wrists or too much on my shoulders, and I should stop doing the pose. If I'm good to continue, I'm going to push into my hands and come into a pretty full back bend. Now, this is a big stretch on the front of my body. This is also a lot of flexion on my wrists. So if you haven't warmed up at all, I would not recommend doing this pose. That's why this pose is usually done near the end of class, because your body should be pretty warmed up, and you should have done at least a little bit of spinal flexion before doing upward facing bow. Also, some wrist stretching like cat-cow would be ideal. When you're ready to come out of the pose, you'll tuck your chin into your chest, bend your elbows, tuck your chin, and slowly lower down. Now, there's a few things you want to focus on when you're in the pose. The first is your feet. Like I mentioned in bridge pose, you want to keep your toes pointing forward. A lot of people will start to turn their toes out here because it's harder to keep the internal rotation of your thighs. So again, you can imagine squeezing a block between your knees, a balloon between your knees, or some people might even put a strap around their thighs. I don't love the strap around the thighs. It just takes a lot of time to get into. I think you could easily put the block in between your knees, and then if the block falls, you get a good idea that you need to engage your inner thighs more. Different teachers will say different things about should you engage your glutes in a back bend or should you not. Now, to me, there's not always a black or white answer because everybody is so different, and how long you've been practicing yoga versus your neighbor versus any prior injuries or even what you've eaten that day. All of these things can affect your yoga practice. So I'm not going to say one is right or one is wrong. Personally, I do like to engage my glutes in a back bend. I find that I can get more stretch on the front of the body. I think of this like the opposite of a forward fold. When you're in a forward fold, you really try to engage the front of your body. I always say squeeze your upper thighs, squeeze your abdomen. You're gonna get more stretch on the back of your body that way. That's just how it works, two equal but opposite forces. Now, in a back bend, I think of it as the flip side. So the more you engage the back of your body, the more you contract, the more you're gonna lengthen the front of your body. However, if that's causing you pain, especially in your low back, your lumbar spine, I would avoid doing that and relax your glutes in this back bend. Once you get up into upward facing bow, I would recommend pushing your chest towards the space behind you. So once you're up, your hands are down. I'm trying to push my chest towards what would be the back of my mat. I'm trying to push my spine in behind my heart and completely relax my head. There's no need to hold my head up. I just want to drop it back, almost like I'm trying to look towards where the wall and the floor meet behind me. I'm rolling a little weight to the inner edges of my feet, like the balls of my feet, not my toes because my toes are light, but I want to feel more engagement in my inner thighs. I'm gently squeezing my glutes, like I'm not doing like a glute raise where I'm squeezing as hard as I can, but I have engagement in my glutes. Now, if this is, you're like, I can do the back bend part, but it's a lot on my wrists. What I would recommend is taking 2 blocks and putting your blocks up against the wall. Now, it might take some trial and error here to find how far you want to go from the blocks. But now I can kind of push into the blocks. So instead of having my hands flipped upside down, they're flipped at a little bit less of an angle. So it's gonna help out my wrist joints and help me get more of the back bend without compromising and hurting my wrists. So what that would look like is now my wrists don't have to be at that sharp of an angle, and I can get a little bit more back bend, and then I'm pushing my chest towards the wall. So this to me feels pretty nice because I don't have to worry so much about, I'm just pushing. I'm not worried that the wall is gonna move. So I almost feel getting down's a little bit more challenging, I find, but I almost feel like I can get more of a stretch because I don't have to stop myself from, if you're in a regular upward facing bow and you're just trying to push your chest towards the back of the room, it almost feels like you're gonna collapse that way. Whereas if the wall is there, you can keep pushing, the wall's not gonna move. So you can almost get more of a stretch in the front of your body that way. Again, that's also great for any wrist pain because your wrist is not gonna be at such a sharp flexion. That's pretty much all I've got for upward facing bow. Please make sure you warm up before doing this pose. Again, this is why it's usually done at the end of the practice. So please don't just jump into this tutorial and think you can pop right into it, especially if you've never done it before. Again, I always recommend doing some of these poses like this one with a teacher in person who can watch you and see what you're doing to make sure you're doing it correctly and safely. But I understand also if you don't have a teacher in person, so hopefully this tutorial was comprehensive and helpful, and maybe you can start practicing upward facing bow with a little bit more confidence. I hope to see you back next week. We're gonna kind of build off of, not really off of this pose, this was probably our deepest back bend, but we're gonna do some more stuff on our back next week as a little hint. I will see you back for episode 38.